She'd like to collect name tags from you if you're done with them. I'm sure we all know each other well by now, so we don't need them anymore, right? But they can be hard to come by, so we like to recycle them when we can. So if you see she's gone farther afield to find name tags, but yeah, but she'll bring it back. So if you please recycle your name tag now that you're done with it. We just have a quick announcement from Rhoda, and then we'll get started with our final plenary session.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, tēnā koto. I wanted to just say to you all that some of you who already know about ICAR, the International Conference on Adoption Research, that you will have already heard from me, but there's a lot of people who may not have done ICAR 4 or ICAR 3 or have done one and not another. Unless you did ICAR 4 last year in Spain, you're not on my list. So unfortunately, what I got given was just last year's list. So I wanted to take advantage of being in a collective of people, some people, not all of us, who are interested in intercountry adoption and say that I am hosting ICAR 5 in New Zealand early January 2016. So you've got about 17 months to plan. Start putting in your funding application, start planning your research to present there. It's not just research in a strongly empirical sense. It's stories, it's qualitative, it's quantitative, it's assisted reproductive technologies, it's adoption, it's a whole host of those aspects. So don't think that you have to be a scholar. But it is a research conference. It's not a users conference. It's not for adoptive parents. I'm hosting that right afterwards. Some professionals come, but most of the time they go to the adoptive parents conference that's afterwards. So this is for the professionals, the agencies, the practitioners, the scholars to disseminate, to share with each other, etc. So if you are not on the list and you wish to come, there are a small number of flyers left. Kristen has them. And if you email me, my email's at the bottom, I will add you to the list so that as announcements go up, you'll hear from me. The website will go up early 2015, as will my initial call for papers. And you'll learn much more then about the different types of formats and the different areas that we're looking for, but pretty much the sky's the limit. So I hope that you will think about it. New Zealand is an absolutely spectacularly beautiful country. Most people don't need a reason to come there, but I'm giving you one. So I hope you'll come down. And thanks for giving me a few minutes to share. Tēnā koe.
Okay, so to keep this moving and to do this well, we have really short reflections. We've asked for 3 or 4 minutes from each track. And we have the special needs track up here and ready to go, I think. So the reflectors, can you start to kind of line up so we can... or come up and sit, please, because we can keep this moving, literally moving. And... the idea about reflection is to both report what happened, but also to give some of your, the idea of reflexiveness and your own thinking also. So, I hope that we've done very well with that very much yesterday in terms of doing that pretty tightly. And I hope that we can kind of stay within those minutes so that we can, again, open some things up more broadly and continue the discourse. Are we ready to go with our special needs reflection? Should we start there?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Hello, everybody. I've reflected on the session on special needs adoption, and I'm going to summarize my reflections under the line of who is special in special... There you go. Okay. So I'm going to summarize my reflections on the special needs adoption by asking who is special in special needs adoption. What else shall I do?
It's on. We'll switch.
It's not
Maybe
on.
That one's better.
Oh, sorry.
It is on. I'm going to put on this. No, you're looking towards here. Okay. Try that.
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe you can hold it.
Right. Not good at multitasking. Can everybody hear me now? Okay, so just very brief reflections on the session on special needs adoption, which I'm going to summarize under the heading, so who is special in special needs adoption? And as a group, we started discussing, trying to define what are the special needs adoption. And we came across the, disability as the obvious sign of a child having a special needs adoption. But then we sort of come to discuss the fact that mixed race children could be classed as special needs adoption, or children with siblings could be classed as special needs adoption. And then, so that we started to question the whole idea, so who is special in the whole concept of special needs adoption? Is it a child? Is it a placement who needs to be special, as in the case of, catering for sibling groups? Or is it sometimes the parents, the adoptive parents, who are special, and perhaps the special needs is the label that warns them that these children might have additional needs and not necessarily be special needs children? The reflection sort of went, and the discussions went around how then we can best prepare, how parents can best prepare in terms of dealing with the children. And there was quite a lot of discussion around having preparedness at various stages, almost, at the moment of selection, making parents aware of the additional needs of those children that are up for inter-country adoption, or even in domestic adoptions, and then perhaps having a second tier preparations, looking at supporting parents when they are matched with children with particular needs. We had sort of discussions around the use of special needs as an awareness, but also being careful when this could become a stigmatization when children would be classed as special needs when there's not particular reason or diagnosis associated with that. And there was very clearly, discussion around the need for post-adoption support in those special needs placements, both when the special needs of the child are manifest at the point of placement, but particularly when some of those needs may become manifest only later on in life. So, for example, in the case of young children, special needs may not be manifest at the time of placement, but they may become apparent later on. Another point of reflection was around best practice. I don't know what else to do. Okay. Okay. So another point of reflection may come around examples of best practice on how best organizations can provide training, organizations and agencies can provide training to support parents. And we've heard an example from Italy, which was about increasing parenting capacity. And my reflection is that we need to sort of gather the evidence-based for such training programs before they are declared best practice and they are exported in other contexts. And last but not least, one of the reflections is about the research messages. We know quite a lot now about special needs adoption, both from domestic adoptions and inter-country adoption, and this was not the case 10 or 20 years ago. What we are lacking now is a synthesis of all this knowledge. And there were comments made, well, one study says that, and the other study will say exactly the opposite. So I think there's a mandate for research now to bring these messages, these clear messages together, to say what we agree, what we can confidently say, what are the best ways to support special needs adoption, or even to identify what these special placements may be. I'm really sorry that not everybody could hear me from the beginning. I'm very happy to repeat if I'm allowed. We're out of time, so I'm going to pass it over.
Thanks. I'm reporting for the group that was discussing force, fraud, and coercion. And I take it that part of what we were doing in that session was really looking to see again what are the similarities and the differences between adoption and surrogacy. And the session started with a presentation by Karen Ratabi and her student, Lopa Mudre. And the starting point, really, I think, coming out of Karen's work, which is on adoption, was to name a number of things that I think most people would agree are concerns within the adoption world. And I take it that these are things that also, in a different frame, are concerns for surrogacy. So I'll summarize them. There is, in fact, a concern about who is the mother, or there's debate, discussion, both about the language, but also about the attribution of that role. And that clearly is also an issue in surrogacy. Another issue is the role of money and the way in which this influences relationships. And again, I think you'll appreciate that that also is a concern in the context of surrogacy. In the context of adoption, there are problems with the consent process and the way in which things are understood, both in the ways that that relationship can be distorted externally by things like money, but also how there can be a lack of understanding and appreciation, perhaps, that there will be a full break in the relationships. And that, again, we see in certain contexts in surrogacy the same kinds of concerns playing out. And then I think another thing that I thought was particularly interesting was this comment about the housing of the girls and the women, both in the context of adoption and surrogacy. And Karen named this specifically as a site or a place where we will socialize people into relinquishing either legal rights and responsibilities, and then more specifically relinquishing their children. And so we see this again, both in the context of adoption and surrogacy. And then I thought the last point, or at least the last one I recorded, was the role of medical professionals as recruiters, again, both in the context of adoption and also surrogacy. So I think the starting point for the conversation was very helpful, sort of saying these are things we think we know in one arena that we think overlap, perhaps with some differences, but important similarities. Then we had a presentation from Lopa, which I think is really important. I'm going to summarize as briefly as I can to just say that there were interviews on site in the field with 25 women. Again, lots of caveats about not extrapolating from that and generalizing from that, but a couple of key points coming out of it. That the motivations seemed to be primarily about money, and it wasn't money for luxuries, it was money for basic necessities. We're talking food, we're talking housing, and how do we need to pay attention to that. Interesting commentary about the fact that in many cases this is because the partner, the husband, is either underemployed or unemployed, and in some cases it's because they're single women. There was comments about how there was evidence, or at least in some of the commentary, that people seem to be being educated into a win-win perspective with respect to the activity that they're participating in. The third point is the issue, there were questions asked of the women in terms of how they felt when they handed over the baby, and there were both perspectives. Some said they felt good about this, some said they cried, they didn't feel so good about this, but overall they seemed to all have in common the view that these were their children they were giving away, whether they had a good or a bad feeling about it. So in other words, they may have accepted that this was an appropriate thing for them to do because it's what they'd agreed to do, but that the starting point was that this was their child. Two last points. The final question was, do you feel you were taken advantage of? The data from at least this small group was a resounding no. And so the question Karen Ratabi put to us is, are we then superimposing our ideas about exploitation onto these women if they answer the question, have you been taken advantage of, with the question no? I have 15 seconds left for my quick reflection/commentary, but I did want to share because I think you needed to hear that summary. I think that this research and these comments invite us to really question the idea of what it means to take advantage of someone. And I think in the literature on exploitation, there is this notion of an unfair advantage. And I think that one of the things that's important to appreciate is that the people may have answered this from a personal perspective as opposed to a structural or societal perspective in terms of the understanding of taking advantage of, because I would argue that structurally that's the only reason to travel, because there are advantages to the commissioning or intending couple in doing that. So finally, I think we are invited to think more about such concepts of autonomy, agency, coercion, exploitation, undue influence, and I think we need to just do a lot more work around that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm speaking for the biological families and whatever else they're a part of. I don't know the whole name. It was sort of long. So, anyways, I am actually doing the two sessions, or the morning and the afternoon. So, the morning I was in the same session as you. So I will not. You did a great job of summarizing. So I won't go over that. I will just point out some things that I saw. And one of the interesting parts, I guess, that I saw was that things don't always. We have these ideas maybe that when you say surrogacy or a surrogate, and these ideas of who they are and what they are. but it's not always like that, as the study showed. Was like some of these women, they actually saw benefits in it and everything like that. Now, of course, whether they were influenced to say that, that's a different thing. But anyways, that they actually said that. So it brings me back to like when you look at actually the situation in Korea, of course, you think, okay, these are young women and they're uneducated and these things. But actually, the majority of them these days are not. That's not that case. They actually do have some college education. So of course, this is important when you consider like if you're going to address this problem, then are you addressing the right problem? So you really have to think about what's the actual situation going on. And actually, for the second part, then we talked about that was foreign aid in orphan care and assistance to birth families. And then there was just discussions on poverty. So, and it sort of came to the idea that poverty isn't a justification for adoption. In poverty, actually, there was a talk on, and it wasn't the real issue. And actually, what was found, the speaker had mentioned, was that in a lot of cases, it's vulnerable families who faced a sudden obstacle. So it wasn't necessarily the poverty itself. And then, there are CRC provisions, because a lot of people think that the CRC is only aimed at children, but there still are CRC provisions that do focus on keeping the family together. It's just that the application is problematic. Now, so then there was actually two speakers, and they sort of told different sides of the same topic. So, like, one of the, I guess, the tensions between them were like that first. The first speaker had said that the players cannot and should not respond at a micro level to poverty, players being the agencies, et cetera. Where the other side was that, well, if there is the belief that if you structure the programs properly, there can be some control to them with these players. So if you give contributions or donations to them, so they could still operate at a micro level. And then the example of Uganda was given. So, and there's talk about how that Uganda at the moment, they are working on social welfare structures, and they are progressing, but they're actually having also a problem where orphanages and agencies come in and disrupt those problems, or those situations. So, and it comes down to, too, is like, should a donor dictate what happens in Ugandan village? And then there's another presentation. That last one was about framing childhood and best interests. And that one was talking about the social agency of adoption. And they're saying that development of identity is not really recognized. And also there's a discussion around the idea of language. And for example, like, you'll talk about the saving these children in need of a home. But at the same time, if you have refugee children on a boat, nobody really talks about them. So those are the major issues. And I'm under, actually, so. Oh, there you go.
So many sessions. Is Susie really the last reflector? Are we really at 4 reflectors? No, actually, there's a reason to put Susie last. I think everybody would very much will get to that. Can we have the reflector from Marcy's track?
Oh, I started, okay. You said it.
Is that the timer?
Yeah.
I have eaten up my time.
Make sure to stay close to this.
Okay. I think our group began by actually talking about Marcy urging us to think about what actions we, first of all, what we got out of this 3-day session, and then what actions might we do as a follow-up to what we heard. And I think most people stuck to that agenda very carefully, but I should say that Marcy articulated something that all of us were feeling, which is that it was very sometimes confusing, tiring, but at the same time very energizing in terms of the new ideas and horizons that it opened up for us. Clearly there was an appreciation by everyone about the parallels between inter-country adoption and surrogacy, both in terms of similarities and the differences. And it helped crystallize some of the ideas. Most people who had only worked on surrogacy issues felt that they learned a great deal from the issues confronting the adoptions and how it might be relevant to the issues of surrogacy. There was also a great deal of appreciation for the information on surrogacy practices that were described. The sessions, although most of the work related to India, because we did not have representation from other countries, except perhaps a little bit from the U.S., that they actually, what we learned from these narratives, it was evident that even within India, one could not generalize about the impact of on egg providers, the women who carried pregnancy. And I personally cannot deprive the so-called gestational carrier of her belief that she was a mother to the baby that she was gestating, because that was one of the ideas that contract pregnancy, that there's a money transaction, therefore maybe motherhood is not within her grasp, so to speak. The contracting parents were perhaps less visible in the discussions, even though they were the focus of the surrogacy debate. However, there was consensus that the benefit of the intercountry adoption and surrogacy group meeting together was the attention that was drawn to the child. They were missing entirely in the discourse on surrogacy. This lacuna was acknowledged by everyone, but one reason I think they have been missing is because of the notion that of the child is not concrete to begin with in the discourse on surrogacy, because it begins with an idea and it's only gradually that the baby actually develops. So, and it is certainly one that is so surrounded by the medical terminology that it gets lost, the baby gets lost in all of that. We alluded to the role of doctors, either as recruiters or providing medical assistance, but I do not think that in terms of either engaging them directly or really confronting them with what they were doing. And I think that that may be something that we need to do at some stage. This is me talking or reflecting on what we had said. Certainly, this is something that needs to be done in the global south. Undoubtedly, there was underlying tension was whether or not to regulate surrogacy or to not regulate surrogacy. Most people felt that this tension, and possibly many people, changed their position vis-a-vis this issue during the course of the 3 days. It was interesting that even those who opposed or supported the idea of surrogacy, the idea of creating a convention, had very different notions of what a convention might do. And I think that that is where we need to have a better understanding, because we really have our own idea of what a convention will do. So even though I changed my position personally, that I began with the idea that we have to regulate, because that's the only pressure point that we have with the countries that are completely rogue countries, as the term that was used by Sonia, that maybe the international instruments have helped in other instances, so it might help in this as well. But I think that if there has to be a convention, it needs to take into account many of these issues, and banning should be one of those issues that we should seriously consider. I think most people identified their what they would do as follow-up, people who wanted to go and do advocacy work, people who wanted to go and do work on educating the general public, but there were also people who identified research, what areas of research they might do. So how am I doing for time? I think I'm out of time. So thank you.
Okay, last but not least, Susan Mapp in our group, you're on.
Am I going last because of the pieces of paper?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure what piece I needed to put last.
Yes.
Okay, as she said, I'm Susie Mapp from the United States, and I'm talking about track 4, which was force, fraud, and coercion, and we were joined by a number of people from other tracks. This made for a very interesting discussion. So we got to know each other, and we were supposed to start off with thinking about similarities and differences, which is where we've been, and we dove right into the debate of, similar to you, about regulating versus banning. You know, do we want to develop a convention, but then does that legitimize the practice? Do we want to talk about banning? We moved the conversation then back to reflecting across our days about some of the similarities and differences, many of which we've reflected back to in previous days. So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts. One of the similarities, for example, is that we need to move the conversation in both areas to the broader context, that we're not just looking at the particular individual, the particular child, that we need to be considering the impact on the extended family, the community, the country, that we need to not just be thinking in social work terms, the micro or the meso context, that we need to be moving to the macro. And one of the differences is that in intention, not always in practice, but intention, surrogacy is a business, adoption is a service. One starting with a parent's desire for a child, one is supposedly starting with the best interests of the child's need for a family. And then thinking about the idea that we kind of came back then to this idea about the Convention on Surrogacy, and it was pointed out that surrogacy is an ever-evolving technology, and that whatever legislation that we would craft, it's always going to try to catch up to whatever is currently existing. So then we had about 5 minutes to start thinking about action steps, and we noted that whatever steps we take, that we need to be considering both ethical and legal issues, that it is not sufficient to consider one or the other, that we need to be reflecting on both. We didn't do as good a job as your group, evidently, about thinking about what steps can we be taking. So if you didn't do that in your group, I would challenge you. I have been to far too many of these meetings where if you don't walk away with concrete steps and who's going to do them, it's been a lovely 3 days full of hot air. You don't accomplish anything. So I take that as a personal challenge, and I would challenge all of you to do the same. How will you work to create change, whatever that is for you, whatever your sphere of expertise is? So the last thing, and why Karen made me go last, is we took a vote within our group about how we felt about the proposed idea of a convention on regulating global surrogacy. Would we be for such a convention in the hopes that this would then create regulation to remove or at least reduce the exploitation that we feel is occurring? Or do we feel that if we created such a convention, that this would legitimize an inherently unethical practice, and that we should not take such a step because it is inherently an unethical wrong? So I believe we have all the pieces of paper because we're supposed to be doing our own vote. Okay. Absolutely not.
We have our track results, but you have a piece of paper. And I understand that framing...
Just come in, because I kind of object to this process.
Oh, okay. Hannah has to live with some implications of this.
I'm not sure what we're voting about yet. I don't know what we're voting on. There's no ideas about what a convention can even constitute yet. What are you voting yes and no to?
We want you to say yes or no, and then say something under it is, I would say no to surrogacy, full stop, or I would say no to a convention without this or this.
Regulation. That's not necessarily an issue of international regulation. And I think there's some confusion on that issue too, but I think at the moment we're at such an early stage of work, I really don't think that this is helpful. I'm sorry, you can still go ahead, I'm just going to express my opinion, and I think on behalf of the Bureau,
I would like to say out of respect for how hard their work is, that I think that we should hear that very clearly.
It's not, I don't want to try and stifle it, it's just that there's no idea yet what it really, I'm not sure what
I have a lot of empathy for how hard this work is because I've been watching how hard they've been working for many years now, and I don't want to create more hard work. I want to be a part of doing something well and being collaborative. So we're going to stop this process. We thought it was really important for us because we needed to know at the end of this where we all kind of were. So we'll report that.
I'm sorry, and as to say, I really don't mean to stifle it, it's just that at the moment I'm not sure what we would be voting on, and I think it could really backfire.
And actually, I was doing that out in our track, but our track decided to do this. So let's.
So just within our track, just this very, as she said, simplistic question that we phrased. We had 2 abstentions, I don't knows, 5 yeses, and 9 nos. And that was our discussion.
I'm also a lawyer, so I want to say that I found the way that the question was presented rather confusing, because for me regulation can include bans. Okay? So a regulatory system can include selective bans. It doesn't mean that everything is allowed and organized. So I think that just the way that the question was presented. Should I say that again?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let me say that again. I'm also a lawyer, and I found that the question, the way it was presented, was misleading, because regulation can include bans. Regulation can ban some elements and regulate other elements. And the way I heard the question presented, it was either we want to ban it or we want to condone it. And it's not clear-cut in that way.
So is any, can I see David? Okay, it's Kristen.
I'm sorry. I have a. You got it? Okay, we'll put a mic on this side then. Do you want to do that?
Just wanted to respond to the question about the question that our group posed and tried to clarify. And certainly, with respect to the Permanent Bureau, we're not going to do this for the whole group, and that's fine, so our vote isn't important. But I do think there are different pathways forward because there are different problems. There's the statelessness problem. And I think that is something that was, I don't know if we said it in the summary, but that some in the group are very concerned about the children with statelessness parentage problems and the desire to address that. Then there's the concern that that you have a lot of countries that consider commercial surrogacy inherently illicit. It may not be criminal, but it is not like adoption. It is an illicit, inherently commodifying, inherently exploitative. Even if we could improve the situation of the surrogate mother, it would still be inherently commodifying for the child, still be inherently exploitative. So the question is, as a matter of direction, then there was the other question, which we did not deal with as a vote, but can you break off, for those countries that do choose to engage in the process, this matter of improving the situation of those women involved in it? And maybe that could be broken off, and we did not deal with that. But as an international convention that would be dealing with countries that have very different approaches, some of which have this as a legal procedure, and it's not well regulated right now, I think we would agree, and other countries that have it as an illicit practice, is it possible to create a convention that solves the statelessness problem, possibly improves the circumstance of the surrogate mothers without legitimating? And as a lawyer, I don't think it's possible to do that as an international convention. So perhaps it's my fault, but that's why it was posed in that way. I do think it's possible to deal with the statelessness problem, for countries to do that. I think it's possible for countries to deal with the labor problem and to improve that circumstance, but I'm not sure that an international convention can deal with those problems in an effective way without legitimating. And so that's why we put it in that either or. Now maybe that's a false choice. That's a fair critique if in fact there's a way to do that. Thank you.
Anyone else? Wow. We were trying to create conversation here. Are we all tired, or does anybody want to respond to that? Because
This conversation is quite separate. How do you endorse what I'm saying? If you want a discussion about surrogacy, have a discussion. I said the issue that we are talking about at the moment is about The Hague, and I think that we are not ready to say that. They've been thinking about it much longer. It is a very complex situation, and we've got to reflect on it and in turn pass on our thoughts. But I mean, the issue of surrogacy can be discussed. That's for you to do. But I mean, the point that's being made is that nobody wanted to say more other than me about this issue of The Hague. So I think we must respect The Hague position. I certainly would have said the same thing if I'd been working with them. And I think we move on to what we can say as the conference.
so I think the reason why we have arrived to the whole, what do you think? Because we've been going round and round, and some people said, well, I've actually changed my mind in the middle of this conference. And so that's one of the things that we were finally starting to say, well, where are you? And we did it secret ballot, right? Because, you know, how much can you talk about this if you take a position other than the pervasive one in the room? So that's one of the reasons why we got there. So that said, is there anything else that we should shift gears on? Because this is our real wrap-up. This is about 3 days, not just the reflections from the last sessions. Rhoda?
I just want to say that I was disappointed we didn't get to the point of where from here. I'm a researcher, and I'm going home with plans to do research. As was said, I think that even if it wasn't stated explicitly, if it wasn't put down on notes, I hope everybody is going home with some notion of, this is what I'm going to do. Yeah. 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 Okay, good. So I just, you know, for the spirit of accountability, I'm going home to do research. And hopefully we'll be feeding some of that back in some medium, perhaps at ICAR, perhaps at another meeting, perhaps just in the journals, perhaps to the people who are living it. But that's my aim.
Okay, so, okay. Do we have any more questions from the floor or comments? Because we have one now from one of our reflectors. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out there for thought, that people might take away with them, is that I participated in this discussion in the way that I think most people participated in the discussion, which is that we've looked at 2 activities to see where are they the same and where are they different, and there's a lot of good heuristic reasons for doing that. But one of the interesting and challenging things, which I think everybody here knows, but I just wanted to make sure that it was said overtly, is that part of the complexity here is that with assisted human reproduction and no clear understanding with respect to some of the issues around parentage, the 2 issues come together, because you do end up in scenarios where people are having to adopt children that they may even have biological relationships to, depending upon the legislation within their home country. So I think that's one of the things that I think just we need to remind ourselves that although we've been talking about a convention for A and a convention for B, sometimes what happens in B requires moving back to A, just in terms of positioning. So I just wanted to say that.
I'm going to take your approach, which is, what am I going home with? And in the conversations with the delegation from Guatemala, what they said they were going home with is with better understanding about an issue that they didn't know how to call it in their countries. And cases are emerging, and they didn't know how to call it. So now they go with a clear understanding about what it is surrogacy, how it's taking place in some countries, and then it allowed them to actually look into their own legislation and say, okay, this may be contemplated here, in this way, here in that way. Do we need to? And then they go back then to their countries and get a little bit more clarity about that. How, based on their own position, based on their own experience, based on their historical context, based on their cultural context, how can they deal with this new modality that can impinge on not just the right of the child, but the right of the women, the right of families, the right of the culture as a whole? Okay. And so I'm going home also, like you. Wow. Do I have to engage in this research?
Does anyone want to state a personal goal, like we've had 2 now? Okay, so I think that just to reflect on this slightly myself. Oh, okay, Laura. Treaties, okay, good. No, absolutely.
I mean, I probably have lots of personal goals, but this is probably not the time or place. No, I just want to say something about actually the difficulty of framing the question, the difficulty of understanding the question, and the sense that many of us have changed our minds often more than once in the course of the last 3 days, which is actually, I just want to name that as a particular status for contemplating a convention on surrogacy, which is not yet. that we're still compiling the research, we're still compiling a sense of what would different kinds of ways of responding to surrogacy, what would they imply? What would they cause? And I think that that's actually a recommendation of sorts, like, let's wait.
I only have to add one short line to that. I would like to suggest that we're also inviting other bodies to contemplate the whole issue of surrogacy. For example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, or maybe the UNODC, or other bodies, not only the Hague Convention, all due respect, but maybe other organizations also could play a vital role in this discussion.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to clarify in this process for myself is that I keep kind of coming back to the global inequalities and this idea, well, hey, they can't make money any other way, so let's go ahead and be complicit in this is one of the things we're kind of struggling with. And so some of those global inequalities and looking at those and structural issues also need to come to the table as we bring in other organizations around fair work, equitable work, fair wages.
Okay, so this is a combination of what I'm doing and a comment on the treaty comment. I started a project a few months ago. It's a long-term project which has a goal of doing two things. Of A, articulating a code of ethics for inter-country medically assisted reproduction, which can be an answer to the ideology of me, which drives the market and the desire for children. And I think that that's something that we need to be doing as well, because the market ideology is very strong, and we need to be paying attention to the ethics, to the principles of ethics that might include responsibility and care and respect and reciprocity and values that are not part of the ongoing discourse about these matters. The other goal is to produce a draft for an international human rights convention. Now, just for everybody here, these processes take a long time. And I'm not saying don't go out now. We do have enough information. We do have enough information. Let's assume we have enough. We know enough. We certainly know enough about India. We might not know enough about China. We might not know enough about South America. We might not know enough about Eastern Europe. But we do know enough. But this is a process to get the international bodies moving on this. It's going to take a long time. So there's a long work, and we need to be talking about this. And I'm going to invite people, if you're interested. I'm organizing a mini-conference in Jerusalem on the ethics of inter-country medically assisted reproduction, helpful and harmful practices, because I think that we need to be looking at what is helpful and looking at what is harmful. And if you're interested, it's taking place in Jerusalem, and there's a call for abstracts, and anybody who would like to have an e-document of the call for abstracts, I'm happy to send it. Jerusalem, 6 to 8 January 2015. It's part of the 10th World Conference on Bioethics and something else. But within this 10th World Conference, where, by the way, there are attendants from dozens of countries around the world, and this is why it's a valuable forum. And it's not a very thematic conference, but I'm organizing a thematic mini-conference within the conference, and I would very much welcome attendance from abroad. Unfortunately, I do not have any funds to assist participation, but if you're at all interested in following up this work, it can't compete with what went on here. The depth of what we did here is really remarkable. But nonetheless, if you want to continue exploring these issues and working, preparing papers with some kind of deadline, please be in touch with me.
Any other reflections? Anyone want to share anything at the moment? Well, I would like then to call up the chairs and to give a bit of a reflection. Should we hold them to 4 minutes? Okay. But if the chairs would come up, Then I've asked them to also give their quick reflection on just a few points that they really are coming away with. And if we turn that into action points, fine, all the better. But just to give us a sense of how they came out the other end of the forum thinking about these issues. So. So we can go in order of the numbers of the thematic areas for, you didn't sit in that order, but that's okay. We have 2 mics here.
I think, Kristen, you're going to go afterwards, right? Well, let's see.
I'm number 2, but I'm number 2, but I can start.
She's got a mic too. Go ahead.
I nearly thought I was going to get to go second then. Okay. Forgive me. These are very brief. The reflections were done with consideration from the participants in my group as well. So it's a combination of our reflections. And one of the things that we all felt came out very strongly in our thematic group that concerned the best interest and the implementation within the convention was that if intercountry adoption was deemed to be an appropriate intervention into a child's life, that there should be some kind of obligation on the part of sending countries for the preservation of information about circumstances of the adoption, all that is known about birth parents, about birth family, and that as far as possible, adoptions could move away from what some have referred to as a clean break approach, which is not necessarily the only way to do adoption, and that adoptions should be kept as open as possible in the interests of not only the child that is adopted, but the first family that is left behind, and the adult that the adoptee becomes, and so that there is an opportunity for a route back. And if there is some way of maintaining information and of the obligation to maintain information for the search to be easier if the search takes place, that was something that seemed to come across very powerfully across the few days. The other reflection that our group wanted to draw up was around the special needs and adoption, and about, again, the importance of information that is attached to a child that sending countries receive, that sending countries send, and the information and education of all those involved in those special needs in adoptions, and the importance of post-adoption support, of the support for families and the children themselves, and that alongside, if special needs adoptions are deemed to be an appropriate intervention, then alongside those adoptions, there should be education and support to enable the preservation of those families in the first place, and that greater support and greater education should take place alongside those adoptions to ensure that the stigma around disability, the reasons for relinquishment that are about an inability to care or to support those children should be addressed alongside interventions that create those intercountry adoptions. There was also a plea from, finally, I don't know where I am. Oh, I've got 28 seconds left. Sorry. There was a plea that what we've learned, however flawed, about best interests and the subsidiarity principles, however flawed our understanding of that term best interests is, and we've heard a lot about that over the last few days, that the knowledge that we have about it and the knowledge that we are growing about best interests of the children involved and the adults that they become does not get forgotten and just restricted to adoption and is used more widely and understood more widely. And one final thing that I wanted to point out was that in our final session, there was a suggestion from Hans van Loom that adoptee groups should be invited to take part in the Special Commission, and I think that would be absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
I'm starting before the time. This is on, or this one? That's working at least. Okay. Yes, we also talked a lot about the so-called clean break principle, and of course it's not just a legal principle. It has many psychological impacts, and it's about power. So just to add to what Sarah said, we felt that there should be at least some kind of an obligation to send information back to first families in the Hague Convention. At the moment, the birth family or the first family are there mainly in the role of that we need a consent from them, and after which they're forgotten. The other issue we talked about a lot was the subsidiarity principle, meaning that the child should first have the right to stay with the family of origin, and if that can't be arranged, then domestic adoption or other possibilities. And we felt there are problems in the implementation of these. It was pointed out that The Hague seems to leave the question of subsidiarity to the countries of origin, but there are no clear guidelines or checklists. And these can be and are violated in several cases. For example, it had pointed out that in China, there's evidence that there are in fact enough domestic adoptive families within China for these children, and yet intercountry adoption proceeds. But we also felt it's not just about, we shouldn't leave this on to the sending countries only, but also somehow put pressure on adoption agencies within the receiving countries. I mean, we all know that numbers for intercountry adoption are declining rapidly. So there is this element of competition within countries, within agencies, who in some cases even seem to feel that the fact that domestic adoption is increasing in the so-called sending countries, or first mothers could keep their children, is somehow a threat to them. And the other issue about subsidiarity is that while it's pointed out that, for example, in many conventions that poverty should not be, it's not a justifiable reason to take a child into an alternative care. And there are mentions of this in intercountry adoption also, but it's somehow not clarified there. And we need to work on this, to put in place some guidelines on how to achieve this. It was pointed out that in many cases in intercountry adoption, it's the first mother or the family who is maybe in a temporary crisis, just doesn't have a place to stay, no job. 1 minute. So there ought to be, we felt strongly there ought to be some kind of a help assistant package or something, or else we need to put pressure for there to be some kind of assistance, which cannot totally be left to the countries of origin because they can't do it. And then the other thing was that we felt there is a certain global-centric bias in the convention. For example, how it talks about the proper family environment. If you tick the box according to the convention of what is a stable, permanent family environment, you end up with a very global, north-centric, exclusive nuclear family. Whereas in many countries of origin, there's a larger family constellation and other possibilities on who should care for the child. I know. And and who is an adoptable child, not to mention who is an orphan, is not such a clear-cut issue. And hence there are also I'm out of time. Just two seconds. There are problems with the concept of informed consent. I mean, what can what could that mean in some very coercive conditions where the mother doesn't have any other options, or their own government oppresses them, as in the case of China. So there are these problems, but I don't have time to go into our other points, but maybe these were the main points. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter is next with agencies.
I was thematic group 3, and we had the dreadful title Agencies in the HCIA, as a result of which everybody I invited for the first month opted for one of the other ones instead. So I agreed to share our session with 1 and 2, and the result was, for me, a tremendously exciting set of discussions of key issues, many of which have been mentioned in the few minutes allowed to the first 2 speakers. But we ended up with a very interesting group of people. We had agencies, we had central authorities, we had academics, we had adoptees. And this led to a challenge to thinking through what an agency was. And one of the things that I would like to say that we did find was how varied agencies are, so that the 4 countries we had represented each had a totally different structure. And I realized that agency was a very dangerous word, and the accredited body wording of The Hague is much more useful. And that led us on to the question of accreditation. What is this? And why is it important? And how do we carry it out? And how do we extend it to the whole practice when technically it appears to be usable only in relation to those who ratify the convention? And I also remember the words of William Duncan that this is a minimum and you can build on it. So we began to think very strongly about what would make a good and what would make a bad agency. And then we addressed the thing we had to, which is, are agencies not part of the problem? And we had been facing, I think, for all 3 days, a lot of attacks on agencies as financially out for profit, and I hadn't met many that were, and so on. And so we had some discussions about financial transparency, about how you can accredit more effectively, about what to do about agencies that went bad. And we moved on from there to look at the whole issue of financial transparency. And that seemed to be very important, to see that we knew how the money was coming in, why it must come in, how it was spent, how we could avoid profit-making that was illicit. And we also went on to talk about the crisis that faces agencies at the moment, which is, for example, that there are less and less children being adopted, and therefore agencies have to adjust to the realities of that situation when their sole source of money, in most cases, was the payments by the parents who were seeking to adopt. And so that is creating a crisis which linked to another very exciting session we had with Sarah's, which was looking at special needs, and to realize how complex this is, how much work it takes, and how it's oversimple to think that this suddenly changes intercountry adoption into something ethical and marvelous, that there were new sorts of problems to face. And finally, we went on to dwell on what possible solutions there might be to this, but also to begin to think a little bit about the link with the other half of the forum. And I must say that the session I had, in which we shared with the surrogacy theme, was one of the most interesting ones, simply because I realized how little I knew about surrogacy. I hope that a lot of the people in surrogacy learned something about the way we do adoption. We saw some parallels, and I think we began to think about a lot of them, but then we also saw some ways in which you couldn't simply clone one to another. And so that seemed to me very stimulating, which is why I was very hesitant to vote anyway in relation to a convention. I think we did a lot more thinking, and that may lead to a convention being explored, and that would be exciting. It may lead to be a convention that then nobody would ratify, and that's another point. And my final point really is to say that I think this is something that has been a most exciting opportunity for us to discuss through. And the one thing that came out to me from that last session, I got 2 seconds to say this, was that, I mean, in all the discussions I had hitherto seen about surrogacy, the one thing that was not mentioned was the product of surrogate relations, and the importance, therefore, of being able to record what was going on, to think of how a child might think about this if they knew they were born a surrogate, through surrogate, was absolutely vital. And central to all of this was, are we in any way informed about whether those who commission births in this way do think they should tell the child, and how many actually do? And I think we need to move on to that as a priority. I'm over time, sorry.
Okay, so we started
self-policing.
Okay, so we started with the whole idea and the goals of our session were to take the concepts of force, fraud, and coercion and apply them to what we know about what has occurred in some adoption cases, inter-country adoption cases, and how may that be similar or different from the concerns that we know have emerged from the circumstances in India very much, but also elsewhere with the surrogacy business. So we started with that, and embedded in that was this question of exploitation. And we've grappled with all of this, but I want to say that force, fraud, and coercion comes from the Palermo Protocol around human trafficking. And there were themes of human trafficking all across all of our discussions, and what it means to commodify, what it means to be a part of a system that commodifies. We in the intercountry adoption world have struggled with this. Those of us who want to keep adoption as an important social function struggle with this. And then how does this then bridge to surrogacy is a really important point. Also coming from human trafficking, Rowena Fong pointed out is this idea of the 3 Ps. So how do we protect? Well, sorry, let's start with prevent, the continuum. How do we prevent? How do we protect, and how do we prosecute? And so we did sometimes structure around that, and sometimes we knew we were structuring around that, and other times we were kind of floating around that. But really, if we did some thematic analysis, we'd have how do we prevent the exploitation, how do we protect people who are vulnerable, and how do we prosecute? And we did want to go over to prosecution. We want to talk about how do you really go after the unscrupulous, the people who are nefariously involved in taking advantage of people, because we want that answer. How do we really truly protect and send a message to everyone that certain things are totally unacceptable? But we have to also talk about protecting people in vulnerable circumstances in other ways, and I think that's my greatest frustration that I have, is that we are actually reducing down to the question of the individuals. That's always important, but we have to pop back up to the macro structure, and we have to ask ourselves, why do we have such gross inequalities that create these circumstances for women, whether it's in an inter-country adoption fraud where women may not understand what's occurring, or women are groomed into their child being trafficked. It'll be so much better and your child will get a good life and you'll be able to stay in touch, which really is not a promise that can be kept. How do we go up to this greatest level and we're at a development studies institute, essentially, right? How do we start talking about the world being a fairer place? How do we talk about those structural inequalities and creating opportunities for work that is not around exploitative labor, but work that women really, really want to engage in? Because women will say, I'm choosing the best of my options. How about some better options? So we did a lot. And we did move towards some actions. And, it's pretty clear that dealing with the statelessness problem is very big. Children being stateless is a serious, serious issue that needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with quickly. Where we're moving in the other areas, that was where it got very gray and very complicated. So we did move towards some actions around that some of these things must be solved quickly. I can't really go through all those in detail and stay within the time limits, but we are pretty clear about building some sort of a technical report that captures the knowledge of the wisdom of the people that we invited to the track. I'm going to say one thing about those invitees to the track. I am incredibly disappointed that no one representing surrogacy chose to come. They chose us as a secondary, but very rarely did they choose to actually come be a part of our dialogue. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, I'll start from that point. So the people in the surrogacy group, actually, I don't know if everyone was aware, most of us knew each other before we came to this meeting. Some of us had worked together and are working together on different collaborations. And so I think there was a sense that we wanted to move forward on a conversation that we've been having over some years. And I think that was one of the things that really enriched our group. And there were some people who had been focused on adoption, whose focus was perhaps shifting or expanding to include surrogacy, who joined us and whose contributions were invaluable. But that might be part of the reason, Karen. It wasn't anything besides that, I don't think.
And I don't doubt that there's lots of good intentions. I actually didn't pose the question in that way, but I posed it as how do we really, this is that cross-fertilization that we really do need to be working together and creating spaces for that. I think we've started that here. And how do we move forward?
Let me say a word about that, too. I think that our group, there were differences in our group, and I think, as we've all acknowledged, there were differences within people, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or 3 different people. But we really did share a lot as well. I mean, I think everyone was at least extremely queasy about some of the practices that we're seeing in commercial surrogacy. That's a pretty minimal statement, but I think that's very clear. And I think everyone had a commitment to, values like human rights, social justice, and the ones that Carmel just mentioned as well, the solidarity and care. And that is a very important, larger values context, because it is very different from the bioethics, the mainstream bioethics context that is often invoked in discussions of these sorts of issues. So I think that's something we should emphasize. We did learn a lot about adoption issues in the plenaries, in the cross-cutting joint sessions that we had from the people in our group who have worked primarily on adoption. And I think when we went around the room today, many people acknowledged that they felt that they had learned a lot and that their previous work had sometimes short-shrifted the issues having to do with children. But I would also note, I think it's important to note that I've seen that some of the discussions of surrogacy in other contexts actually short shrift the concerns about the women and the women who are called surrogates, as I think Sally put it at some point. We don't want to erase them. We cannot erase them there. And many of the people in our group come from a women's health and women's rights background as advocates, as scholars. So I think that's really, we've enlarged our focus, but we certainly don't want to lose our focus on the issues of women. So, the other thing I wanted to say was I really agree with you that we do need to hold these larger contexts in our minds, the contexts of global inequalities, the social and political contexts of global inequalities based on class, on gender, on sexuality, on race, on caste. Those are really important, and we cannot understand the issue of surrogacy and the issue of intercountry adoption as well, if we don't hold those in our minds and in our hearts. So that is one larger context. And the other larger context that I'm going to mention, is that several people in our go-round mentioned that there's a larger technical context that we have to remember. And I think that's part of what some people mean when we say surrogacy is moving really fast. It's not just moving geographically, but it's moving in terms of what the technologies are that are used. And many people in our group have been working in those larger technical contexts that embrace other kinds of assisted reproductive technologies, embryo selection technologies, prenatal technologies, new ones, like the ones where you can take a test when you're pregnant at 8-9 weeks and get a complete readout of the fetal genome, and issues about geneticization, issues about someone raised in the plenary, inheritable genetic modification, changing the genes we pass on to our children. Those are not so science fiction anymore. And then Marcia Darling noted that children can have 5 parents, the gamete providers, the gestational mother, the intended parents, and actually, Center for Genetics and Society is doing work. We now have children who can have 6 parents if a technique that's being developed moves forward, because they're trying to combine 2 eggs of one woman. And this is one of the scientists developing it has actually started a company to develop this technique for age-related infertility. Okay, so I'm going to take another minute because we used up some of the minute on the other conversation. And what I wanted to say, this is a point that I made in the group. It's been so useful to think about the analogies with adoption and also the other frameworks that have been brought up, the analogies about labor and work and standards and struggles around that, and the analogies around sex work specifically, and also several people brought up organ transplantation. So we could have a whole conference on any of those other analogies besides adoption, and I think it would be fruitful. But as helpful as those anthologies are, I think maybe one of the things that I realized over this 3 days was that these analogies are also quite dangerous because we cannot fit square pegs into round holes. And honestly, I think what we need is new categories for thinking about what surrogacy is. And I don't think we've come to those yet, but I think we should be striving for that.
Can I just ask briefly if any of some of you mentioned a few things around surprises or actions that you plan to take. Does anyone want to take another minute just to throw out a few of those? And we also can then open that up to the group. But I want to give chairs first dibs on any things that were truly surprising to you, if I can get personal, and or actions that. Concrete actions that you yourself would take or that were recommended within your group that you maybe didn't mention already?
Yes, this is just a frustration over the fact that we are always mentioning global inequalities, etc., as in the beginning or at the end. But I want to know what can we do about it? What are the concrete steps to do about it, so that it's not just something that, yes, we should take this into account, but how could we translate it into actual action? And some points that we discussed in my group were concrete measures of assistance packages or how you could organize it, whether you could organize it actually within the inter-country adoption agency business where there are problems with that, or whether it should come separately. But it's just, I'm very frustrated about inequality, but what can we do about it? We can't just continue business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was also useful in that group to put in the context of, again, coming back to broader development issues, and that we need to develop broader childcare systems within these countries, especially sending countries for adoption, for example, and not have those interrupted by a sort of commodified market. So, yeah.
I've already talked a little bit about that macro structural, the world's very unequal or inequalities. So I'm going to actually go to a different macro level, which is our group had a very sizable, to some degree, representation of social workers, and that's because those are my social networks to some degree. And so we've been talking about what does this mean for us. We happen to all be American social workers. What does this mean for us as a discipline? And what are the next steps? And because we're all in the academic line of social work at this point, all of us have been in practice too. We've all worked directly with women in poverty in some way in our lives. But how do we take this information and start to inform our own discipline, because our discipline is dedicated to vulnerable people, that oppression is what drives our work. And I think that I'm always talking to my students about, okay, we have oppression and then we have opportunity. And so how do we go from the discussion around oppression and start looking at creating new opportunities for people to understand their circumstances better? And so this is around the research agenda that really we know we're going to have to get going to some degree in social work. And because there's so little about this in social work. And by the way, in American social work, I would say at least, by the way, the second most common destination country for the service of surrogacy is the U.S. We haven't even talked about that, really, I mean, you might have been your surrogacy track, but in the U.S., social workers are snoozing. We're not thinking about this at all, really, as an issue. So then there's a whole line of work that we know a lot about consent in social work. We know a lot about ethics around consent. So we're talking amongst ourselves about the social workers in particular about what's next, but also we're really committed to taking what we've learned in our track and try to make that not only about a complex conversation and something that's fascinating, but also what do you do with that? Like this is a lot of energy. The amount of energy that took to make this happen, everyone being here and bringing their expertise to the table and really engaging, this is a lot of extra energy. What do we do next with that? So corralling that into a technical report and other things, those are on the agenda for us.
I came into this world of adoption with a background in demography and population, and when I first started writing, I had this concept of Malthus hovering over me, and so many people would say intercountry adoption is the solution to poverty, it's the solution to overpopulation, it's the solution to plague, and all of those things actually have surfaced. And I realized, first of all, that from my own statistical work, it's not the poorest countries in the world that have been sending children. And even now, Korea, as a rich country, is still sending more children than virtually all African countries. The second thing I realized was that plague, I hadn't really thought about that one, and then it hit me about Haiti. And I came out of this 3 days even more convinced that adoption after Haiti was wrong, and that we must learn this lesson. A second lesson that I learned was thinking about where the children come from. Now, generally speaking, it is clearly from poor to rich, from black to white, from south to north, and that we nevertheless mustn't forget that there also are heritage adoptions from poor Indians to rich Indians living abroad, their relative adoptions. There's so much more to think about in some of those respects. So, I mean, I agree the agenda of poverty must be there, but the idea that we even think of intercountry adoption as solving that, it doesn't. It may be relevant, it may be helpful for individuals, and the tragedy is that so many individuals are not being helped or being wrongly helped, and I think that's very important. So, I mean, yes, it's been for me very, very stimulating. I'll mention two final things. One I've already done, which is I've learned so much about surrogacy, and it's reminded me that history of adoption is a long one. And there was a time when it was thought perfectly reasonable not to tell a child that they'd been adopted, that we're still fighting in most of the states of the United States to unseal birth records so that people can find out even birth-based facts. So what am I doing? Saying you should have this for surrogacy. And, you know, we need to take some of those lessons on board and remember the context historically. And I do think that one of the things is that we do probably need much more history to understand how long it's taken intercountry adoption to get where it is. And I feel, and I may be alone in this apart from a few of my friends over there, but I do feel that things have moved on, that they are better, that the Hague Convention has done some very important things, although there's many problems which have been highlighted for me. One of them is this question of money. And I do want to repeat the point I made, that most adoption agencies I know are very responsibly run. They're not for profit, and they have got very real financial issues, but it's not a result of them trying to make money out of the situation. And finally, somebody said to me, well, would you not like to see an end to intercountry adoption? And I said, well, I think we will, as we saw an end to child migration from the UK. But if we do see it, even if it's suddenly happened in the next 2 or 3 years, there's 1 million children out there who have been adopted, and we've got to have in place structures that continue to support them and inform them, and therefore that these situations are ones that don't go away. And the same will apply to surrogacy, even if we decided to ban it or not have a convention.
Only really briefly that I just want to thank everybody for sharing information with me and enabling us, and myself particularly, to learn so much more. And I think the thing that I'm taking away with me is just the reiteration of how important information is, big information about knowledge of birth origins, but smaller bits of information about the context and the explanations as to why and who made the decisions and when was the decision made and what the process is involved in that, and just the information for all concerned in adoption particularly, but also surrogacy as well. The information is so important, and I think that's the message that I'm taking away with me, that however insignificant a piece of information might appear to one person, it's hugely significant to another, and that we should work really hard to retain as much as we can if we're going to support those million adoptees and their families, first families and adoptive families as well. Thank you.
So I thought what I would do is just really briefly mention some of the projects that people are working on, just to give you an idea. And if they're really concrete projects, I'll probably mention the person's name, but otherwise probably not. So a number of people said that they were going to be doing additional research on a whole variety of different areas, all the different players, policies, and several people mentioned new angles that they had come to as for the research. Then there were a couple people who talked about publications. Miranda Davies, I don't know if she's still here, has been commissioned to do a book by Zed Books that's situated between academia and sort of media type tone. So that's exciting. And then, of course, we're going to be making this report, all of us together, right? And there was some talk about special issues of journals, or perhaps even a collected volume coming out of the report, or some of the publications that we've had. And we're going to have everyone send all of their publications on surrogacy. We're going to continue to use the Moodle and have a bibliography, in the report of all the publications the participants have done. And then sort of related to publications in a way, several people mentioned doing work with media and being able to talk about these issues in a way that makes our key points in language that people can understand who don't have an extensive background in this area, but how important that is. And a number of people mentioned that they're going to be going back to their groups, their organizations, and reporting on this set of conversations that we've had there. So, Deepa from India and Isabel from Mexico, and certainly people from Sally from Our Bodies Ourselves and Center for Genetics and Society. So we will be talking about these conversations to much wider networks of people. And let's see, some policy work that's going to be done. CGS is working on a compilation of country-level policies that we're going to liberally use and borrow from what the Hague conference people have done, and that some people in the group, have said they would like to work on. And I'm going to approach some other people who said they were interested in it and see if they might be interested. And Carmel has already mentioned the project the long-term project that she's working on, and the conference that she's putting together in January in Jerusalem. And then I think Sally at a plenary mentioned this very exciting project that Our Bodies Ourselves is taking the lead on, and CGS is going to work with them on an online resource, and it's been recast. It's not an online resource for intending parents. It's an online resource for people who are thinking about, maybe do I want to get involved in surrogacy? And so that's a really different thing. So those are some of the, I hope I hit most of the main projects that people are working on.
Okay. Did you want to add to that, or? Excellent. Yeah. We had a few interviews, but I didn't know what came of them, so thank you.
Rhoda? I misunderstood. Are you talking about a little about being media savvy about this topic, or are you talking about collecting what's already been in the media?
No. Some of us, based on our work, our advocacy or scholarship work, are contacted by media, and when these stories about surrogacy burst into the headlines, like the one recently in Thailand. Be careful about
what you say. Can you share that? Because that's what I'm asking for. Going back to New Zealand and the fact that I'm going to be trying to engage some conversation, I want to be prepared to represent accurately. So if there is, and others may have the same sense, if there are some tips for being media savvy around the topic, it would be great if they could be shared on Moodle.
Okay. Noted. Great. The mention of publications and reportage brings me to the topic of output. And for this meeting specifically, what output do we want to have for this meeting? Now, initially in our discussions about this, we had said that we have full use of the ISS working paper series. And we had initially said that we would have a report for each thematic area. But as we had so much cross-fertilization and as the course of the 3 days wore on, we were wondering the utility of doing that or if we do something together. So I guess we're a little less certain now around how we want to actually do our reportage. But I think there is some consensus that we want to have the people who've been here, of course, be able to have some period of feedback on whatever is produced. So I wanted to put that out there to everyone in terms of just immediately from the output from this meeting specifically, aside from all the sort of waves and ripples of other publications, talking to the media, going back and doing new research. Very specifically, the output that we have here, I want to know what you think. And of course, if people from the Hague Conference have particular ideas about this, wonderful. But what do we want to see in the immediate future around our output? So I don't know if people have thoughts on that. But if you do, lovely. David has his hand up. I'd rather, because it's hard to hear on the streaming and stuff, especially.
Okay, I do have a thought about outputs, but first I want to share one surprise, which is I have been surprised that the Permanent Bureau people have been so dedicated, and I think they should be thanked. I don't know if... one of the things that I learned when I first started to become involved is that we have all these expectations of them, and they're so few. That they would take their time when they're overwhelmed by what they're supposed to be doing to spend these 3 days here, I think is very remarkable. Especially we academics, at least I'm an academic, not everyone here is, can kind of go on a bit. And so, but that leads me to, so I think that's extraordinary. It's been one of the special things, and not only the present ones, but the past ones. We had people here like Hans, William, Nigel, who were part of the creation of the Hague Adoption Convention, and to have that experience and background and history made this very special. A number of my heroes on the board, on the Permanent Bureau and outside were here, and all kinds of people, a number of the people that I've learned from, and that's made it very, very valuable. As to outputs, though, I want to express a concern, which is I keep hearing the word we, and so forth, and I almost have heard a frustration like, what are we going to do next? And I know that for myself, that the worlds I come from, my own views are very contested, to put it gently, and I never come to an event like this expecting that like we are going to agree on this. I'm very aware that the Permanent Bureau is subject to democratic processes, to countries, as frustrating as that is, but that's a good thing because we don't really believe that we should be deciding this for any particular nation, let alone for the world, the people who happen to be gathered here, as privileged and as great an opportunity as that is. And so I don't want us to oversell an expert report that all the experts think X about Y, because as much as I would like to trade my thoughts as all the experts agree with that, it's just not true, let alone people in the places we come from. So we really have to be modest about this. That is my, and even if we have a relative agreement, we have to be careful that because the way the conference was organized was fantastic, but inevitably, like if the surrogacy people happen to mostly know each other and the bioethics view on surrogacy wasn't that represented, and I know that the critical of adoption, but not necessarily against adoption, is critical of intercountry adoption people that I've been working with for years, we're a little overrepresented here. I could go to other adoption conferences and you'd hear a lot of different viewpoints, and so let's not represent that this is what the experts think about intercountry adoption and surrogacy. The last thought, though, is that the grouping of the two is much more natural than we've admitted. It's not just an arbitrary academic thing. When infertile couples, same-gender couples, and singles want a child, these are the two options that they look at. So the other thing, looking at the report, is this is a natural coupling. Ordinary people couple these two topics. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks. And yeah, I would say that there's no way in which we're going to actually have a report that comes to consensus around any particular issues, but rather I think the goal is to actually somehow accurately portray the diversity of opinions around it. So thank you. Yeah.
And I think it's up to us individually, what are we going to do next instead of maybe what we're going to do next. But I would like to recommend, I really value the 5 different tracks. And I would encourage you to write up the 5 different tracks. And then I think as a qualitative researcher, if you write up the intersection of the tracks, as we look at the 5 tracks, we will naturally see the commonalities. And I think we're also going to see the divergent viewpoints. And so from that, you can look and see kind of where we all have commonalities, but where we are going to differ. And then and different from you, David, I love multiple perspectives. I love multiple perspectives. To test it and not just like that's how I feel. Some of us will do practice, policy, research, agency administration and all of that. So I think we've been challenged. I mean, we've come in, I love the multicultural kind of perspectives because when you think about it, we really are all so unique. I cannot replicate in Uganda. I would not want to in India or in the United States or in Russia or wherever. But I think there's commonalities that we're going to see, I think, from the reports. And I think as you maybe see the commonalities, then we can figure out what's the next steps. I would hope, I know it's been hard work, we can do another one next year. I do want to thank you all because I think you've given a gift to all of us.
Thank you.
Here, here.
Any?
So,
It's off. Push the button on the bottom.
Thank you for all of the work that you've done, and I think you deserve a longer applause. Our mention, besides, how you organize that report and so forth, is what language you use. And I think in this, from the beginning, there was a lot of concern as to how do we refer to this actor and that actor and this act and the other act. And there are, although I also am all for multiple perspectives, I really would like you to look at it, all of this, from a social justice perspective and not a commercial perspective. And the reason is because, there is vocabulary that actually dehumanize people. And the use of gestational surrogates, for example, although technically that is correct, it leaves the women in this case completely dehumanized. And we need to keep in mind because it strips who that person is, a human being, and it looks at it more as a wound for rent. So keep in mind as you refer to, the language and the language you use, to keep in mind the meaning and the meaning that we really want to give as well in the future to all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to say a word. People prepared wonderful presentations. We only had a few presentations, but people prepared some wonderful presentation, and those are really outputs too. And Sonia Allen prepared a wonderful primer on public and private international law. Hannah prepared a wonderful PowerPoint on the Hague Convention, and Diane Beeson led the writing of a really great article on terminology and made the points that you just made, and at some length, and explored the different terminology that's used. And that is all available. We'll send you copies, or you can go on the Moodle.
We all are experts in the Moodle now. This is, yes, hold on. We'll be sure, we can work out any glitches, but we'll be sure that we try to collect all of these. And I think because people have access to the tracks they'd chosen and not necessarily others, we'll put on the general part so everyone has access to them.
Okay, so I've been asked by all the chairs to make, oh, Laura.
Yeah, on behalf of all my colleagues, past and present, I would like to thank you all for all the very instructive discussions, for all the information. I think it has been very helpful for us, for food for thought, for the next special commission. That's our next big step in June next year, and then we will continue working as well on the parentage surrogacy project. I think it has also not only been very interesting discussing, but as well very interesting meeting many of you, many that we knew by name only. So I think the human contact of all these kind of events is very important and help us to continue working. So as always, we take all the good compliments, but as well all the criticism and the way that we think this is the way to move forward. And as we discussed in the different sessions, I think it's important to, in order to move forward and to learn, to really listen to the different actors and the different points of view. So we really thank you for all your contributions. And yes, finally, please also take into consideration that we are the 5 here representing the Hague Conference, but we have a very specific mandate, so we have always to be very careful with what we say, what we do, because we represent 76 members of the Hague Conference, so we have 76 states plus the European Union. And so this is also something that has to be very careful, and we also have to be very specific and very clear when we have our own opinion. So again, thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you. Thank
you. We have a comment from our Guatemala contingent. Came quite a distance.
This is out of the record. The Guatemalan delegation wants to thank Dr. Rotavi for inviting us to this forum. We have shared experiences. One of them is to share with so beautiful ladies all the discussions. And we, with my colleague, we are more enthusiastic of applying most of your experiences and improve our protection with the abuses from children in Guatemala. So we are very compenetrated of what we have to do, and we expect to have your support in the future. So if you come over to Guatemala, you will be welcome to come over and share with us our experiences. And we will let you know in the future what we will do, for sure. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the chairs have asked me to represent them in saying to Kristen, who kept it organized through this whole process. We started with a conversation a year ago. We should do this. I think we can make it happen where I work, and that turned into where we are sitting today, and that was not insignificant. So we can joke about all the different times the conference calls had to take place, and we literally, the amount of hours that went into just us doing those conference calls, but then Kristen's literally figuring out, like, what is the glitch, that glitch with that part of Moodle. I can't imagine what your life has been like. Okay, yes, and that is one of the points, too, is this takes teams, and we know we have volunteers, et cetera. But we wanted to say to you, Kristen, before we get to the wider group of people who made this happen, as a group of chairs, we really appreciate your pioneering, your spirit, your vision, and your ability to keep it organized.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Well, everyone's preempting my thanks to everyone else, but I mean, since we're on that topic, then I want to throw it right back at you. I wanted to also, on behalf of the ISS, thank you for all your work in bringing all these fabulous people here. And we have a little token of our appreciation, which is our very unique ISS cookbook. Because we have people coming from, on average, any given year, our students and our staff come from 60, 70 different countries. We always put together a nice international cookbook, but it's in English. So you'll have a lot of good recipes, huh? So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for all the great work that you've done. And again, for the participants, we asked you to do a lot of stuff, right? We asked you to, talk a lot, which usually isn't a problem for most of us. But we asked you to, come prepared and read things and do a lot in these sessions. And again, I think it was partly because we wanted to characterize it more as a forum than as a series of presentations where we always run out of discussion time. And I think that as much as a lot of us were saying that our heads are swimming with even more information and more sorts of ways in which all of these issues ripple out, I think we can make some headway, and we have made some headway in a lot of these issues just by sharing. So I thank all of you. So let's give a hand for you. Again, I want to thank people, other people from the ISS, because again, I didn't do this alone. The people who gave us funding, the research program, People, Environment, and Resources, our staff here, our student volunteers, and especially Sharmini Bisasar, our staff administrator back there in the shadows. But she turns a lot of wheels and makes it happen. And we also have our media folks, Anwar. You might have seen the guy in the box back there. There he is. As well as facilities and so on. So I thank all of them. And just I think as a final note, unless anyone has anything else, we'll take your comments back, and we'll think some more and continue to have conversations about output. So again, I'm sorry it'll require you to still use Moodle, but we don't want this to be the end. We actually want it to be an opening out and a beginning of something, and I think it has been that. So we will put information on there, and we will also have more discussions given your input about output and see what we can come up with that will accurately characterize this event. But also, if you do have publications and things like that, news stories that come out as a result of this, make sure you let us know, and we'll also post those on the Moodle. So you had a comment? For some time. We're not sure exactly indefinitely, but for at least another a year or so, I believe. It's not impossible to keep it up, to keep it running. So we'll continue to use that. So don't lose your usernames and your passwords. Okay. All right. Unless there's anything else, I thank you once again, and great work. If any of you still have your name tags and you do not want to take them home, there is a box that Sharmini has here to recycle your name tags. You can keep the key, the cord, just the name tag bit.